Okay, welcome everyone. We are so happy to have you here tonight for our February month program, Teaching Black History in Arlington, What It Means Now and in the Future. My name is Lizette Arias, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Arlington Committee of 100. I am the MC for tonight, and I'm so excited to have you here tonight. If you're watching us on Facebook Live and you think this is something your friends would like to watch, please consider sharing this stream to your page. I want to start out by welcoming elected officials who are with us tonight. Parisa Deganatafi, Commonwealth's attorney, and I think that's it. If I missed any elected officials, please let us know by sending us a note using the Q&A box. We'll try to recognize you later on in the program. I'd like to take a minute to thank Devanshi Patel and Jeannie Broyhill, board members and program leads for this month. Thanks to their hard work, we are able to meet tonight for what I'm sure will be an excellent program. I'd also like to recognize the contributions of Patrick Hope and John Bishstad, who serve as our co-chairs of the program committee. Next slide, please. Next month's program will be a hybrid program. So you will be able to join us online like you're doing tonight, or you can get out of the house and see us in person. The location and topic for the March program will be announced soon. We will send you an email with the details and post it in our website, arlingtoncommittee100.org. You can also look to the chat box for this link. Slide 4, please. Oh, great. The mission of the Arlington Committee of 100, as some of you may know already, is to address community issues in a nonpartisan, community-wide way. We gather community members so that they can meet one another and talk about these issues. Before we jump into the program, I ask you to help us continue bringing these meeting opportunities to the community. Now more than ever, it is important for neighbors like us to have a place to come together to discuss topics that affect us all. You can support our mission as well. There are a number of ways. One way is to become a member of our organization. So what are members? Members are individuals and couples who make a financial donation to the Arlington Committee of 100 during the membership year, which goes from July 1st to June 30th. You can see the chat box or visit our website for a link to make a financial donation and therefore become a member. You can also send us a check to our address, our PO box. This address is also available on our website. Finally, you can support our organization with your time. Volunteering for the Arlington Committee of 100 is both rewarding and fun. Right now, we are seeking out potential new board members. The link to apply to be considered for our board of directors will be placed in the chat. We're especially looking for people with event planning and organizational skills. We need these volunteers as we return to regular pre-pandemic programming. And now for our program tonight. As you all know, we are focusing on teaching Black history in Arlington. Some of you may know that Virginia's standards for education are reviewed periodically. The history standards were due for review in 2022. And so the Virginia African American History Education Commission was put in charge of reviewing, revising, and making recommendations regarding Virginia's history standards, specifically around Black history. These standards will define what will be taught to all Virginia students. Before I introduce our guest moderator for tonight, I want to remind you that this is an interactive presentation. We welcome your questions. You can submit your questions at any time during the program using the Q&A box on your screen. We'll ask your questions to the panelists during the Q&A session after the presentations. And so I am happy to welcome Krista Jones as our moderator and hand over the stage to you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Lizette, for that opening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Krista Jones. I'm a longtime Arlington resident and founder of Vote Lead Impact. I'm really excited about our conversation tonight. We are going to hear from some very different perspectives on Black history in Arlington. We're going to start off with Atif Carney, who is the Associate Director at the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice, based out of Temple University, that focuses on research, policy, and practice on college students' basic needs and overall college affordability. Before joining the Hope Center, Atif served for 4 years as Virginia's Secretary of Education for Governor Northam. He will discuss K-12 state of Virginia history standards that are edited every 7 years under state law. We'll also hear from Ralph Fleming, who is Supervisor of Social Studies for the Office of Academics of the Arlington Public Schools, and Carrie Hirsch, who is currently the Director of Curriculum and Instruction for Arlington Public Schools, who will discuss what current Black history is being taught in the Arlington schools. And then we'll also hear from Dr. Alfred Taylor Jr., who is a native Arlingtonian, who is also a prolific author, community activist, and researcher, and well-versed on Black history in Arlington. Dr. Taylor will answer some questions about the importance of local Black history in the school curriculum. Each speaker will have, or group of speakers will have 10 minutes, and then we'll follow this presentation by 30 minutes of Q&A. And please feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time during the presentations or the Q&A time. So I will turn it over to Atif to start.
Good evening. Thank you, Krista. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you, Lizette and Arlington Committee of 100. And also especially want to thank Devanshi Patel, who had reached out to me about this amazing program. Really excited to be here with you all. And thanks for putting this together. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as we get started. So Krista, are you able to see this? Because I don't know if, are you able to see the screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. I'll go ahead and start. Thank you, everyone, for joining the Arlington Committee of 100's program today and talking about Black history. So I'm going to give you an overview of the history standards in Virginia. So no pun intended. Again, I'm Atif Carney, and I was the Secretary of Education in Virginia from January 2018 to December 2021. And prior to that, I was also a history and social studies teacher in Princeton County and a mathematics teacher for 10 years. So I have a deep understanding of history and social studies standards overall, and then about the process. Before we really get going in the presentation, I know we have limited time, is some basic education terms, because there might be people who are in the audience who are not educators and might not be familiar with some of the terms. So there are some basic terms for this conversation that are relevant. A standard, which is something that is set by the state and that's required to be taught in schools. It's like the what is required by the state. So in this case, specifically what facts the students have to learn at what grade level in history standards. So the standard is set by the state. Now the state can and does, and all states do this, they can propose like a recommended curriculum, which is kind of like a path on how you teach students about specific standards. Many times the curriculum is also developed by the local school division, and teachers have the autonomy as well to develop their own curriculum. They can do that in teams, they can do that individually. They can take a curriculum framework from their school division or from the state, and so forth. Instructional tools, pretty self-explanatory there. Those are things that could be textbooks, it could be internet sources, you can have speakers come in. So there's a variety of ways to scaffold the learning that teachers utilize in instructional tools. The laws around instructional tools are pretty loose, where there's a lot of autonomy on what can be used in the classroom. And those are also being debated with, there is this sort of a movement to see, okay, what tools can be used, what books can be used in the classroom and so forth. But generally there's a lot of flexibility that teachers have. And then other relevant thing is professional development. So teachers get training throughout the academic year, or sometimes off cycle in summers as well. And the training can be on the content of what they teach, or it can be on how they teach. And it could be a hybrid of two things. There are some state requirements. So a teacher gets licensed for 10 years, they get a license if it's a full license, and it gets renewed. So every time it gets renewed, there are certain requirements. There's one thing that I'll talk about a bit later, where there was a new law passed, which goes into effect July of this year, but it was passed 2 years ago, that teachers who are up for a renewal of license, they need X amount of hours in culturally relevant pedagogy. And then pedagogy is a method or practice of teaching. So the timeline of the history standards is that there was a state law that was passed in the late 90s. It came into effect for history and social studies in 2001, when the first set of robust standards were passed for history and social studies, and they were put on a 7-year cycle. So the last time the history standards were updated was in 2015. So they were to be updated by state law and hit the field in 2022, at the beginning of the academic year of 2022. But standards can be updated off cycle. So people often ask me, well, does it have to be 7 years? You have to update them every 7 years, but you can update them off cycle at any time if the department chooses to do so, or if there's some other governing body that says, hey, let's try to look at our standards. In August 2019, Governor Northam signed an executive order to establish an African American History Education Commission. 2019 was also the 400th anniversary of the arrival of first Africans who were enslaved. There was a lot of discussion happening with museums and different community groups and constituencies across Virginia about African American history. So he signed this executive order. The state legislature did not have a role in this, but the governor did. And in this case, this commission brought together historians from across the state and some national experts as well, who have produced a lot of different things. Like there's some famous historians who have produced PBS documentaries and so forth. It brought together educators, parents, students, and so forth to really engage in over a year-long process to provide recommendations. So the initial report, I'm sorry about the typo there, it should say AAHEC. In August 2020, the commission produced their first report to the governor, providing recommendations on what the history standards should look like, but they also provided some other recommendations beyond the standards. In addition to that, there were other groups, for example, the Asian American community, or the Latinx or Hispanic American community, or indigenous community members were saying, well, can we do something about our histories as well? So we were getting a lot of requests, and simultaneously we have about 3,000 historical markers in the state of Virginia, and we started some contests with schools on African American history markers. There were only about 200 markers were dedicated for African Americans, but 0 for Asian Americans, 0 for the Latinx community, and so forth. So we started these contests to kind of get things going and build up synergy. And more we did this, we realized that there was a growing desire among students, families, and everyone to really see their histories represented in the standards. So that's why a bill was passed in 2020. Culturally Relevant Inclusive Education Practice Advisory Committee was formed as a result of that bill, and I will talk about that in just a second. Collectively, by July 2021, the Culturally Relevant Inclusive Education Practices Advisory Committee's recommendations and the African American History Education recommendations, they worked together to have a final set of standards that was given to the Department of Education. And the Department of Education had 1 year to get these standards in front of the Board of Education to get them ready for this academic year. What happened was that at the Board of Education, when they convened in August, at that time, there were 5 new board members that were appointed by Governor Youngkin, and they requested that this is their first meeting, and this is a pretty big ordeal to review this robust set of standards. So they asked for some grace and time to say that if they can have an opportunity to review them before they actually take a vote to start moving the process forward to the next step. Between August and November, things happened, and the state superintendent, when she came back in front of the board, the standards that were originally put together based on the recommendations by the two groups, they were completely gone. And the version that the Board of Education had was really whitewashed. A lot of things were taken out. And that was a significant problem. There was a huge public outcry, which resulted in the Board of Education rejecting those standards and asking the state superintendent to go back and come up with another version. In January, another version was released, and in February 3rd of this year, there was a split vote, but the Board of Ed decided to move to the next step. So now these revised standards, they're open for public comment now. So there will be public commentary for a couple of weeks here before the Board of Education does a final vote in getting them to the field. So they're about a year behind the process, which is, I mean, I know it's troubling, but it's okay. We want to get this right. But definitely what was recommended by the two groups has been pretty much wiped away. And there's there are a few problems currently where we stand is that, voices of numerous Virginians and historical experts, mainly Black and Brown voices who worked for 2 years, are being ignored. There is a state law establishing this culturally relevant advisory committee that has very specific things that should be part of the standard that are not there. And as constituents have provided public comment, there have been overwhelmingly in support of the standards that were recommended by the two groups, and they're being ignored. And a few examples of whitewashing during these revisions is that, for example, initially the state, the standards that the superintendent put forward, it actually took away Mali, Egypt, and China, for example. They were left out. After a lot of public outcry, they were added back in. Only ancient civilizations were mentioned was Rome and Greece. Also in the standard on holidays, Juneteenth was taken out, Indigenous people was taken out. After concerns, Juneteenth was added back in, but Columbus Day is kind of replaced Indigenous Day. And there's a long history, and I know we don't have time to get into this, but on why that shift has occurred across the nation. So that was also surprising. Christmas holiday was added. I personally think we should celebrate the religious holidays. I know there's a separation of church and state, but I think in addition to that, we should mention other holidays too, right? There's Hanukkah, Diwali, Eid. We have such a diverse culture in Virginia. So that's another thing, is that why only this and not other holidays?
Audif, we are actually out of time. If you want to just wrap it up in the next few seconds.
Let's wrap it up. So I'll wrap it up right here, is that these are the last two slides. Basically, this is the components of that bill that was passed, that all of these items are missing from the actual standards. And what I'll do is, Krista, that your audience, you have the slides so you can share it with them in email afterwards. All right, back to you.
Thank you so much. And we might be able to dig a little deeper in this with the Q&A. Yeah. Thank you. So now I'm going to turn it over to Terrell and Carrie from Arlington Public Schools.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Carrie.
Okay, yeah. Terrell and I are going to work together on this segment of the presentation. I am Carrie Hirschman, the Director of Curriculum and Instruction for Arlington Public Schools, and was previously the Social Studies Supervisor. And kind of looking off of that last part of the presentation, when divisions get the standards from the state, we really start by looking at a crosswalk between the previous standards and the current standards, and looking at where we have changes that need to be made within our curriculum. And our curriculum in Arlington follows what we need to do by the state. And I know Terrell will touch on this a little bit as he talks too, but what we get from the state is really the floor of what we have to teach. So it's the required pieces, and we have the autonomy to add in other topics or to use examples in some different ways. And so we really try to be mindful of being inclusive. And we had already infused in the APS curriculum the recommendations that came out of the African American History Education Commission. And we started teaching those in the 21-22 school year as part of the APS curriculum. And we have also been working, we had done work with Dr. Goldie Muhammad and her Cultivating Genius to really think about kind of the 5 different pieces that she focuses on, especially looking at identity and how each student's identity can be honored within the curriculum. And so that's kind of like a high level overview of when we get those standards from the state, we really have to take a look at those and think about, yes, we're teaching those, and how do we make those relevant to our students in Arlington and make sure that all of our students can both see themselves, but also recognize the story of other people that may or may not be like them in the curriculum.
So to kind of piggyback off of what Carrie has mentioned, for us, when we do receive the new standards from the Board of Education, one of the first things that's going to happen from us at our office, in the Office of Social Studies, is we'll start looking at that crosswalk and then start identifying people within our division that can work on curriculum adjustments. And for us, one of our goals is to continuously look at the groups that are served in APS and make sure that they find a home in our curriculum. One of the things that kind of starts as we dig a little deeper is we realize that with the base of the standards coming from the state, and then there's an opportunity for us to really look at what are some of the unique stories that are specifically with Black history from Arlington, and where they can be infused in the curriculum when we start doing our curriculum edits, and looking at it from what I consider token that I like to say is it making sure that it is historically accurate and age appropriate. So making sure that when we start infusing local stories, whether it's about Dorothy Ham and integration of Arlington Public Schools, whether it's about famous people from the community like Roberta Flack who lived in Arlington, we're looking through it through the lens of making sure that whatever information we present to kids, it's presented in a historically accurate way and age appropriate, so that there's not something where I want to make sure I explicitly say this. Some of the things that come up in conversation that people will constantly ask social studies educators is related to things that they see in the news. And for us, our conversation is always, one, what is in the best interest of the students? But two, what are the questions that students are asking, and making sure that we're preparing teachers for that. So part of our conversation is around hard topics related to African American history, whether it's through social justice movements, whether we're talking about slavery, voting rights. We want to make sure that our teachers are prepared. One of our concerns that typically comes up is, because our elementary teachers are introducing the concepts at a foundational level, and they are generalists. They're not like our secondary teachers who are content specific. We're constantly looking at what can we do to ensure that they have the content knowledge that they need in order to adequately instruct the students, whether it's about understanding the nuances of Juneteenth, Martin Luther King Jr., or talking more specifically as they get into 4th grade Virginia studies about desegregation, and really kind of looking at desegregation through the lens of how do we adequately tell students at a 9-year-old or 10-year-old age what desegregation is, what it means, and the importance it played into how our community is diverse today, and our school system serves the needs of all of our students. So we start there, and one of the things that we are happy to share within our community is, as we move and think about what we're sharing for Black history as the kids get to high school this year coming up, we've offered an African American Studies course for the past couple of years, but I'm sure many of you have seen recent news about the AP course through College Board, and we're happy to say that we will be piloting that at 2 of our high schools, so that we give students in the community an opportunity to learn at an advanced level the stories of, I like to say, the stories of us, because for us, African American history is not just a sub segment of world history or US history. It's just the story of who we are as people. And making sure that whether we're looking at it from a world history lens, talking about what happens in Mali, or in third grade, or as we start looking a little bit higher in high school, looking at the continent of Africa and the different civilizations and kingdoms that existed. We want to make sure that our stories are relative to our students, inclusive, and tell a full story. So as some people say, the good, bad, the ugly, but we want to include that as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think that what Terrell just said made me think of, when Atif was saying that, and originally in the new standards that were proposed, they had taken out the ancient civilization of Mali. And that's one example of something we try to be purposeful about in Arlington. In third grade, students study Mali, ancient Mali, and that gives them a perspective of the great accomplishments that were happening on the continent of Africa prior to enslavement. And so really showing them the humanity of people and not having the first time that they're introduced to Black people be around enslavement, and to know that, there was rich culture and prosperity for these people before they were enslaved.
And to Carrie's point, we want to make sure that we infuse, I think, a lot of conversation typically around Black history is 400 years of enslavement, 1619. We want to infuse Black joy into our curriculum so that students see that they're much more nuanced individuals, and two, helping them realize that change that has happened in the US over the course of the last 400 plus years is a result of average individuals who made a conscious effort to make change in our community. And so we want to make sure that through our stories, we empower them to see that it could be them, or they are the next change maker, or the next one that helps us realize, hey, this is a story that should be told. This is something that we need to make sure we pay attention to. Our goal is to make sure we empower our students to be they're the future, so that they can share exactly what they need, and we supply that to them. I think that kind of for us wraps up really kind of where we are with, at this moment, Black history in the community, so and APS.
Well, thank you so much, Terrell and Carrie, for that great overview. We did get a question from Joan, and you all began to talk about when you start teaching African American history. And can you give any more examples of some content?
Well, specifically, it starts in elementary school when you introduce Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and then, as Carrie mentioned, and we talked about, when they get to third grade with Mali, and then as we move to fourth grade, specifically, we'll talk about slavery, the lead up to the Civil War and the importance of slavery, and then we'll talk about desegregation. And as they get to sixth grade, they'll start talking about the Civil Rights Movement. And then as they move to high school again, when they get to world geography, it'll be an opportunity to really kind of examine what does the region in the continent of Africa have to offer for them, and what information can be gleaned from like the economy, gross domestic product, what the population looks like, what are major elements of their culture and civilizations that exist in Africa. And then when they get to high school, having the opportunity, whether it's World History 1 or World History 2, to start examining some subset regions of Africa in a little more depth. And then the same thing when they get to US history and 11th grade, that opportunity to kind of dig in what they've learned already and go deeper, whether they're talking about massive resistance, desegregation, or talking about African Americans, the Great Migration from the South to the North, what were the challenges that were faced, extending into looking about Marcus Garvey. We have those opportunities built in, and then also looking for when we can infuse local stories. So that kind of gives an idea of more in depth of kind of where we are, but we're also always looking for opportunities for if there are stories that should be told, letting us know, and then also listening in from students as they share kind of what they feel is missing or lacking in the curriculum, and how we can find that information and share that with them.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So now that's a perfect segue into Dr. Taylor. As most of us on this call probably know, Dr. Taylor is an educator, a local historian, author, and a longtime resident of Arlington. So, Dr. Taylor, we would love to hear from you kind of your reaction to the information which has just been presented by both the state level and the local level, particularly how it relates to how to incorporate local African-American history into the APS curriculum.
Thank you, Krista. Well, number one, with all of the topics that they are named, yes, they are appropriate topics. My main concern is with the sequencing of the topics or how they are sequenced. For instance, elementary school students, and I have served on elementary level, start to learn about national African-American figures, but they start to learn about local. I think that elementary school kids and things would be better off being introduced to local African-American figures, people who they can see, people who they can touch, rather than the national figures like the Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and them who were introduced to them as having to overcome at first conditions and things. I think if they could sequence it differently, start with the local contributions as the reason I wrote my first book, because they were passing over people who had been local and national contributions. Would it be better for them to learn about a Roberta Flack who grew up in a community, attended one of the Arlington schools, than someone like Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks and things? So they have a myriad of just saying topics you could be, but the sequencing of how that's introduced and how people learn are really different. Kids mostly like feel, touch, and see, and it would be more relevant or more enticing to them if they could see and touch some of these African-American fields. The other thing is where it falls in the sequence, that we only push African-American history during its month, but how can we have African-American history without studying world history at first? I heard Terrell said that they first wanted to take out Egypt and Greece. Well, we have to, first of all, that before Egypt came, there was a Canaan, which were made up of people from African nations and things. Egypt was a hodgepodge of other people saw and conquered it. So how can you tell where you are before finding out where you come from? And I think that the sequences of the whole African-American experiences in the school is out of sequence. And what they did not convince me otherwise tonight.
Okay, well, thank you for that feedback. Also, something that's been really important as we've planned for this event is making sure we're able to get a wide range of local perspectives. Sometimes I think it feels like we tend to go to the same people, same players, same history. And as we know, history, as we're living it, is always evolving. What do you think is the best way over time to make sure we can truly incorporate the diversity of Arlington's local Black history?
One way that history has to start, people being placed in history where their occurrence start. You can't just compact it into all that African-American history. Well, when you're talking about manufacturing industries or whatever you're talking about, you have to plug people in who made a contribution to the era, be it African-Americans, be it Latinos or what. It's tended to everything is built and run off a European perspective. There are 7 continents, and I think that on all of the 7 continents, we can find people who've made contributions to every area. But we do not, we can't just teach the contributions of all in one month, be it Hispanic month or what. We have to start emphasizing people into the units where We learn, and there are many units spread out of where we can introduce African-American life. We can, when we're getting into health and all of that, there are African-Americans who have made contributions to health. We go all the way back to the Hemas who made contributions to medicine. So we have to stop concentrating on this little area and concentrating it on an African-American only started with slavery, that we did not have, that we did not have other things before slavery.
Excellent.
That's why we cannot, I am opposed to us keep compacting African-American history into the one thing of post-slavery. You have to know where you're coming from before you know where you're going.
That's right. That's right. Excellent point. So let's bring our other panelists back up for Q&A. And we did get a request. I'm sorry I had to cut off, but we did get a request for you to do a brief overview of those last two slides that we weren't able to get into for you.
Yeah, sure. I'll put them back up and I'll go over them really briefly because I'd love to hear more from the panelists. And before I talk about that, to Dr. Taylor's point, that's exactly what happened with the African American History Education Commission and the other committees, that they want to make global connections to local connections and take a holistic approach and wrap everything around. And the set of standards that came out of those two commissions, that we really should go back to them, because if we go to those robust standards, they're exactly the things that Dr. Taylor is talking about, and they will be the best type of the way we teach history and the standards ever created in America. Like I did a thorough analysis across all states, and that's why it was disheartening that the process got hijacked and really the standards got completely blown up and watered down and whitewashed. But going back to these two slides, there is a state law which the bill passed that formed this committee that was very specific, that there are certain historical underpinnings that were specifically named, but beyond that, things like the Holocaust and other historical genocides, that these standards really had to get deeper in them, which they don't do, right? The recommendations that came out of the two commissions did that, but the version we are working with right now at the Department of Education doesn't do that. Getting deeper about slavery and the impacts and spinning out, some people can argue that that's not really done correctly in what the version we're working with right now, and so forth, untold histories of other groups. But this specifically right here, the Board of Education has to develop guidelines for teachers and counselors to do age-appropriate anti-bias education. That is something that's also being challenged because, folks think that anti-bias education is, very loaded, and Governor Youngkin has issued an executive order that really kind of hinders this state law to go into effect effectively. Recognition that anti-bias and anti-discrimination, it's something that all staff should really engage in and learn about. So there's a lot of things here that the two commissions worked on to really abide by the state law, which is really not happening in the current version. So to really see that dream scenario that Dr. Taylor is talking about, the recommendation that I have for Virginians is that appeal to the Board of Ed to go back to that original version that the two committees came up with, and let's work with that, because that is the gold standard. Back to you, Krista.
Okay, thank you so much, Atif. We do have a couple of questions, one that I think might be best for you. Let me see. Has the current governor weighed in on what can't be taught or can be taught? Do you have any more to say about what Governor Youngkin has said publicly or that you know of about history standards in Virginia?
Well, I definitely have a lot to say, but not to get too too down the road in this. But I think the overall thing is that there is a lack of understanding with this administration on what really is needed to be done, because the recommendations that came out of the two commissions, those commissions were made up of historians and educators who have worked with children, and they understand cognition and brain development. and it also included a lot of Virginians. So there's a lot of thought put into this. Unfortunately, because of the politicized nature of our society this day and age, all that there was this facade of CRT or anti-CRT kind of created, and everything is kind of getting labeled as that. So my recommendation would be is that if we want to do right by our children, let's revisit what the two commissions did and work with those. And it is disheartening that the process was hijacked due to the pressure by the governor.
Thank you. Also, you know, we've been planning this. We've also talked a lot about how citizens can be involved. And I'd love to hear from all of you. And you touched on it a little bit, but if you can say anything more about the best way for the public, and then for APS, you all talked about the students getting engaged, which is really important as well. But are the hearings effective? You know, what's the best way for public input on the standards?
I'd like to weigh in a little bit on that. I would say, due to the, as a social studies leader in the state, and the conversations that I have with people around the state, I think it's the next component of it is making sure people's voices are heard to the board, making sure that they go to the community listening session. So one that's near us in Arlington is going to be in Alexandria. I don't have the exact date, at Mount Vernon. So making sure that people share what they feel should happen. For us in APS, we really encourage stakeholders to be involved in the conversation. Education to us, we're a public entity. We want to make sure that we hear from the public, and that they feel comfortable sharing, like, this is what we feel should be done. And there are ways that they can get involved, not only for social studies, but in other areas, by speaking at board meetings. There are advisory committees that they can join, and there are regulations that are set up by the school board. And then just by reaching out to us in the Office of Academics and sharing information or insight that they might have. I think, again, kind of what I speak to is, don't feel that your voice can't be heard, and that you should publicly state kind of what you feel is important to you. And volume does speak loudly, as the secretary mentioned, from the standards that were put forth in November, which I would go as far to say is that they just didn't reflect who we are as Virginia. They didn't include multiple voices. They didn't include representation from professional experts that are here in the state of Virginia. And they ignored the plight of, to me, members of the community who expressed concern about how, you can go from African-American history to genocide, to even talking about fascism in World War II, how that information wasn't really properly included. So, the conversation that started in November when people spoke out really spoke to the board at that time. So I think now is an opportunity to make sure that people speak out about what they feel is important, and should be taught in Virginia public schools. So my 2 cents, sorry.
Excellent. Thank you. Atif, did you want to share anything about input at the state level?
Yeah, so I think my recommendation is that I put in a link here, Chris, if you want to join, share with the participants, but it has dates where the Board of Education will be taking in-person public comment at 5 locations, like Joel mentioned. I think there's one in Mount Vernon that's near you in March. But overall, this link also has links to what the August version was, that the commissions, their standards. Then it has the February, this month's standards. So you can do a side-by-side comparison if you have time. Like Carrie will tell you, it takes a lot of effort to do a crosswalk. It's teams of teachers, and you really have to know what to look for. So it's really challenging for the layperson, right? Even I have a challenge, even taught that. But if you have the ability to take these documents and do a side-by-side, I think you'll get a little bit of a better understanding why there is kind of a frustration from folks who are really in the trenches, why it's happening. And several social studies and education associations in Virginia and national base, like American History Association, they really came out against even this latest version. And they also made the recommendation that I'm making, that can we please revisit the August 2022 version and work with that. And if there are concerns, let's put that in front of the public and let's make adjustments to that, but that's the gold standard. So that would be my overall recommendation to our listeners today.
Excellent, thank you. We also have a question about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and how situations like that in our history are taught in the classroom. Does anyone have any thoughts on that or examples?
I mean, I'm happy to touch on that. I mean, I think one of the things we try to do is present students with facts about historical figures that they're exploring. And instead of telling them what conclusion they should draw, we give them those primary sources and let them think about what that means. And so with a lot of our founding fathers, we've talked about that there are both like wows, right? Like they did some really great things, and there's whoa, like they also did this. And so I think, you know, there's not a specific standard that mentions Sally Hemings, but it is the type of conversation that teachers certainly might be having in those high school classes. You know, Terrell mentioned we want things to be developmentally appropriate. And so thinking about where the right piece for that to come in, you know, we for sure talk about that founding fathers enslaved people and that enslavement was a choice, right? Often it's framed as, well, they had to because that's how they were going to make enough money and build, you know, but that's a choice. And so really thinking about those things. And so I think that kind of gets to that idea of like, yes, we do mention those uncomfortable truths in our history.
Thank you. Additionally, you know, a lot of people right now are watching the series 1619. So there's a lot more conversation in society, obviously, social movements. And I think, you know, you all touched on this a little bit, but can you talk more? I'd love to hear from all of you about the best way to incorporate, you know, what really is going on real time in the classroom.
I'd be happy to weigh in, and I'm sure Terrell and Carrie and Dr. Taylor have thoughts too. 1619 project to me is very thought-provoking, very provocative. It really gets you thinking, right? At the same time, that's why it's also been politicized, because it's a way of perspective and looking at things, a lens that it provides that traditionally hasn't been done. That's why it's just getting a lot of heat as well, right? I think that also thinking about things age appropriately, like how we can have these conversations. So something like the 1619 project, you can draw from that for students maybe like later in year, right? And of course, customize it in a way that's appropriate for school setting. But some of these heavier conversations are probably not appropriate for elementary school children, right? You can do it in a thoughtful way. But what the things that bother me, that completely to dismiss something and a perspective and a lens that is providing because our fragility kicks in, right? That's the biggest problem. And that's where we have to like really take a deep breath and say, hey, what are our blinders? What are our blind spots? Let's analyze this perspective in a thoughtful way and see what is the value add there that we can use in schools.
And I think, you know, Secretary Carney said it best with kind of, we like to hit on perspectives. You know, there's a traditional perspective that's been told in history that people are used to. And so whenever there's something that they might feel is new or uncomfortable, that does challenge their thoughts, that presents us as educators with the challenge, but also in a way to articulate that to them so that it's not threatening, that the way that we look at it through, you know, primary sources and hearing authentically from people over time, I think allows us, if we have those conversations and push back. You know, I think so often people, you know, I think in anybody's life, you hear you have a challenging circumstance, and it's easy for you to kind of dig in and go back into your burrow. But I think for us as educators, especially in 2023, it's of the utmost importance that we push back on those narratives, that are being portrayed onto people as they try to explore the conversation. So I think it's kind of nuanced when you're saying you have people who are just saying, let's explore the conversation. And then you have people pushing back on the idea that you should even have that exploration. And I think for us, you know, and I would say this from my short tenure so far in APS, but also my, you know, years of being a teacher, it should be noted that you should push back on that, and that you should challenge that. And the way you challenge it is not by, you never can, to me, face a challenge by going in it with the same rhetoric or tone that somebody else does. But as Carrie mentioned, if we approach this conversation with facts, with historical records, we're able to have that really nuanced conversation. I kind of use it to, I'll kind of bring it back a little bit. When I go to I've gone to the Virginia Holocaust Museum in Richmond, you know, the way it's nice that they can push back on the narrative that people put up against the Holocaust and the genocide is that the Nazi regime kept detailed records because they ran it as a business. And so when we start to kind of look at those historical records that people created, it's easier for us to have that conversation about it when you're presented with information. You know, if you want to talk about, you know, what people's perspective was on the 3/5 compromise for the Constitution, it's better to read the letters from those who are at the Constitutional Convention. And it's better to also look for other articles that might have been written in newspapers that talked about what that meant after it went through in the Constitution, to have, so that you can kind of push back on that narrative. Again, going back to our bread and butter, I like to say in social studies, is primary sources are historical receipts. They tell us the information. We don't have to come up with this magic story for students or the community or members at large. We show them the facts through what people actually said and did at the time. So that's kind of how I would frame it, a little bit of a pushback that way.
Krista, may I?
Yes,
jump in
please.
here? See, my whole problem with the African-American whole curriculum, it is all centered around that the only contributions that African-Americans have made would be in the field of civil rights or slavery. Who are the people that always come up with people who came as a result of that? Very, very seldom do you have the things built around. For instance, this is February is National Women's Health Month. How many people can associate a Black or African American with National Women's Health Month?
Not a lot.
Those are the places what I'm talking about that we lose the opportunity to talk about African American. The first open heart surgery was done by an African American, but we don't associate those two things together. We only associate the Black African American contribution to the month of February. We never highlight when these things are coming on the contribution that an African American had made. We never contribute when we are talking about exploring the universe, the contributions that were made way back in the Haman, Egypt, by African American or Africans into the whole field of astronomy. But we only want to highlight them when it comes to civil rights or slavery types of issues, as though we were slaves all our lives, that there was nothing before slavery. And that is the way, my main problem with the way it's taught, it's the sequencing. Everything is like African Americans only came into being when they were brought to the American shore. There is evidence in 1920, excuse me, I'm getting some interference. They're in Columbus's own books. He spoke about the indigenous people, said that blacks traders came from the Southeast and traded gold spears. Well, you never hear about the African American. We act like, Columbus was the first one who was able to negotiate the well, if it's in his books that they were African American seamen who had come to America, see, we never placed them in the perspective of when these things are happening. We zero it, and it all falls back to the field of civil rights and slavery, not the other contributions.
I think that's a really good point. We actually got a question tangentially related to your point, Dr. Taylor. They said, I'm broadly persuaded by Dr. Taylor's view that local people should have more stress in our curriculum. For example, Dr. Drew, any views about seeking to discuss the demolition of Queen City and the resegregation of the civil service spearheaded by President Wilson? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, those are type of things that should be made in our local history. There's an excellent book on the demolition of Queen City. In fact, I co-authored the book with Dr. Nancy Perry, and she was studying her doctorate. I think the thing is we isolate those things and don't incorporate them into when something is happening, right, or why it's going. That there are more contributions than just Barack Obama was made president. Mm-hmm. We can go back. We talk about writing and hieroglyphics and things of that nature. They come out of Black diaspora in Africa and things of that nature, but we never tell that story. We tell as though everything started with the African American in slavery when they were brought to the shores of Virginia. Not saying that they had been to all of South America, but Africans had been to South America and all of. I just think that all of our history is taught from a historian rather than, as someone said, putting the facts out. And the facts don't have a color, or the facts don't have a weight. These happened at this time. This event occurred at this time. This happened at this time. Put history in this perspective and not try to water it down to fit your situation.
Excellent. Carrie?
Yeah, I'd like to push back just a little bit on how we're teaching some of the stories or the history in APS. I don't know, what the last time was that, Dr. Taylor, that you looked at the curriculum, but we have been really purposeful in already incorporating the changes that came out of the African American History Education Commission. And so our students are in the curriculum looking at Charles Drew, Alice West Fleet. They're looking at contributions in their local community. They have choice in exploring perhaps people in their families who made contributions in Arlington, and sharing those stories with their teachers in terms of performance assessments. I think we start in kindergarten with the community. And so as developmentally appropriate, students are looking at the contributions of people who are of all different walks of life and different colors. We speak about the contributions, I think I mentioned earlier in third grade, it's really critical to us that those contributions of Egypt and Mali are brought forward to students before they're looking at that idea of enslavement, which gets introduced in fourth grade. And so we're really being purposeful, and by no means are we perfect. And there's always things that we're going to be able to do better the more that we know. But really, we've been intentional over the past several years at trying to show the richness of cultures that have existed way before the United States, and that idea of this country being built on the back of enslaved people.
I agree that we should be looking at cultures, but we have many ethnic groups and things there. For instance, say we look at Mali. Big contributions come out of Ghana. We have more students in the Arlington school system from Ghana than we have from Mali.
They also study
so
Ghana.
why
yes,
would we use
Ghana?
when we're talking about that diaspora rather than Mali. And see, those are things I'm talking about, fitting the things that people can personally relate to, rather than his story that I have to listen to his story, rather than to utilize things that people can relate to, see, and touch. That's why I'm my experience in subbing in the Arlington County Public Schools was doing African American history, the same national figures, because that's what's in the library, the book on the national figures, the teachers themselves. Where's the professional aspect of it? That how can you teach a discipline when you yourself have done little knowledge of that discipline? So I need to see how the professional development component dovetailed with the
Wait, Terrell, please, no, you go first.
I was just going to say, kind of, for our perspective, one, we do look at where those things can naturally fit in, and it's highly encouraged for the teachers. But we also have to be cognizant that our elementary teachers are tasked with a task that not many people truly understand, in bringing the foundation of education to a wide group and diverse group of students. And so what they are presented with is they typically have a pedagogical approach to education and not necessarily a content background. And so the challenge for us too is with so many things that are presented to teachers or on their plates, requirements of, as we're trying to make sure students progress properly with their reading abilities, as they are tasked appropriately with developing their mathematic thinking skills. We want to make sure that when we provide professional development and support and resources to teachers, that it's a balanced approach, so that as a teacher starts their career, they're getting the services and resources that they need. But we are also reminded that time is precious. There's 178 days, 990 hours available to teachers. There are a number of standards that we already have to cover. And as we try to figure out when is the right time, in Arlington, we're doing a great job, I think, from my perspective, looking at coming from other divisions and seeing how professional development is embedded into the contractual hours of teachers. So we're working to figure out where is the best fit, so that learning is continuous for our teachers, but it's not by any stretch of the means do we feel like we are even scratching the surface of what's needed to appropriately professionally develop teachers to teach sensitive topics and just traditional history and African-American history. So it's a challenge for us, but I think for us, we're up to the challenge as we look at where we need to be for our students. So, I would, again, kind of push back on the conversation as saying, we realize the opportunity we have in the students that are in front of us and what we need to do. And we're just trying to balance it with all the needs that students have at a single point.
Yeah, one of the things
I'm not saying that we only need to teach African-American history. We're talking in general. The topic was African-American history. But we are talking about, as I said, sequencing things, and the sequencing things that could be utilized, whether it's Latino history, whether it's Caribbean history or what. There's a sequence that I'm more or less against, not against, but more or less I'm addressing. That how we sequence these things to lead to the end result, not just African-American history, because history is history, regardless of who it comes out by.
One of the things that we often forget is our clientele, not to talk in a business sense, is our students, right? And what are the students really want, because it's their learning experience. And we all get a lot of feedback. I know APS is awesome about getting student feedback. I've been to a lot of roundtables and visited schools. But one of the things I hear from students, especially at the high school level and college students, courses they teach, and talking about what their experience has been in K through 12 about history classes, or whether it's language arts classes and so forth, and talking about these things, is that there is a growing desire among students to draw connections to present day and make relevant historical connections, because they can physically see, well, I'm in a school that's very diverse, but if I look at the breakdown of AP classes, I might see racial or gender breakdowns, right? Who is in math classes, who is in language, like what are those breakdowns? So the students are witnessing that day in and day out, and they're asking those questions. So when we got that the African American History Commission going, we had these conversations that the very thing that Terrell and Carrie are mentioning is that, look, we have limited amount of time, 178 days, 90 hours, and even within that, there's so much happening, right? The testing and other things, that how can we meaningfully get to what is our ultimate goal? And the commission really had to answer what is the ultimate goal, because how can we find a good balance between the depth and the breadth of the components? So I think the magic really is, I think to Dr. Taylor's point, is that sequencing, there is an answer here which the commission got at, and that is something that this administration really didn't take time to understand, is that we have this antiquated way of teaching in a linear fashion. There's no reason we can't jump around. We have to be agile, and there's no reason we can take global and local connections. And there's nothing that says that we have to teach about American Revolution at the beginning of the year, and then in the middle of the year, let's teach about World War I and World War II and so forth, right? That's an antiquated way of thinking, right? So that's where, if you, instead of focusing on facts, if you focus on concepts, then what do we want our students to walk away with? What is the American story? Where does it actually begin? Who are the main characters of that story, right? Right now, it's kind of centralized based on certain individuals. And generally when students leave, they have this view that, hey, these were the main heroes of the story. They had some issues, they were complex, they made some mistakes. And there was these other people kind of around them that were kind of like sub-characters. But so you see what I'm saying? Like we have to really, that's what the commission and committee really try to grapple with and get away from. But I mean, I think that the magic is there, that if we get away from that antiquated linear approach and really think about concepts and big concepts, then we can accomplish this within those parameters of 178 days and 990. And that's why I keep encouraging folks. I'm like, look, take time to understand what this commission was doing. They produced something that's really beautiful. If we can just, and that's why I think it resonated with APS, right? That's why they took, I mean, because this was developed in collaboration with local divisions, right? They were, a lot of teachers were saying, hey, we want to really, let's just completely reinvent how we do things, reimagine how we do things. So I think we can get to it. I really think we can get to it if we can, kind of bypass some of the politics of it and just kind of get to it and keep the students in mind. I really think we can get to it.
I think that's a great point to end the conversation on. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Thank you, Secretary Carney. Thank you, Terrell and Carrie. This has really been a really informative conversation. We covered a lot of ground. And I really love the points that were made, really just integrating critical thinking into history. I think as adults and as students, we all need to do that. And it's like Secretary Carney said, keep the students in mind. So thank you all again for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Lizette.
Thank you, Krista, and thank you to everyone that joined us tonight. On behalf of everyone on the Arlington Committee of 100 board, I thank you for all the work that you do day to day and for dedicating time tonight to prepare and deliver this important information and insights and thoughts to us. Again, I want to remind everyone here that we want you there at our March program, scheduled right now for March 8th. Location and registration links will be shared with you over email in the coming days. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please share it on Facebook, and that way we can meet some of your friends, and also they can become Arlington Committee of 100 fans and maybe even volunteers. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you next month.